Hi there, my name is Paul Anderson. Thank you for joining with me in thinking about the New Testament. As you know, I've just written a new introduction to the New Testament, From Crisis to Christ, a contextual introduction, published by Abingdon, and I'm delighted that the book is usable for undergraduate and graduate courses. I've written the book in 14 chapters to be used within a full semester, and after an introductory chapter, each of the 13 chapters on the 27 books of the New Testament deals with the context and the crises of the first century that are most relevant to that particular book. But then also the next section deals with particular literary features of each of the books. The third section in each chapter deals with the themes, the message in each book. And then a brief section at the end of each chapter invites the reader to engage some of the issues they've been reading about. Well, you might ask the question, why would a new introduction to the New Testament be needed? I mean, after all, there are many good introductions out there, so one wonders, well, why would something that is distinctive be serviceable? Well, what I've tried to do in this particular text is to work experientially. What is going on in the experience and the lives of the early Christians? And how do those experiences relate to the content that they're engaging and also furthering? What I also want to do is connect it to experience for modern day readers. So how does the content, understanding something of its experiential and contextual origins, how does that relate to us today in our experiences as individuals, but also as communities, but also the larger society beyond? So basically, I'm interested in this question. How does the New Testament speak to its original audiences with the message of the gospel, and how does it then speak to later generations on furthering the message of the gospel in ways that we need to hear today as well? So let me describe just a little bit about this particular introduction and maybe some of the new things that it offers. After the introductory chapter, each of the next 13 chapters, as I've mentioned, deals with first century crises and contexts. Now, crisis might be a little strong. Sometimes these are issues that are just aggravations, or sometimes they're political tensions, sometimes they're religious tensions, sometimes you even have a crisis between perception and experience, or sometimes you have different groups that have different understandings of things. The Pharisees had understandings that differed even between groups of Pharisees, let alone the Sadducees who were managing the temple in Jerusalem. How did the Zealots think about things? How did the Essenes think about things? If they're connected with the Qumran community down in the Dead Sea, how did they think of things? And what kind of Messiah were they looking for? You think then about the ministry of John the Baptist. What was he doing? How was he challenging people in Palestine of his day? And then how did the ministry of Jesus relate to the kinds of things that John was doing? Moving on into the gospel traditions. How did the different gospel traditions develop? What were their particular interests, and how do they deal with history, but also how do they deal then with theology and with putting forth a message in ways that people could understand but also be gripped by? You think then about the book of Acts. Okay, you have the history of the Acts of the Apostles. Well, how does taking the gospel to the Gentiles, how does that work? And how does the role of Paul fit in with taking the gospel to Greco-Roman society in the Mediterranean world? From there you have Paul's letters, and then you have general letters beyond that. And then finally you have the book of Revelation and the Johannine situation. So what this introduction tries to do is to look at each of the 27 books of the New Testament in the light of its original context or contexts, and then just to try to understand meanings back then, but then applying those meanings to later generations. So that's the first thing that I think this New Testament introduction contributes, that's kind of new and kind of different in contrast to other good introductions that are out there. A second approach that I think is worth mentioning is that one of the ways that I operate is to try to use the strongest methodologies offered by critical scholars, but also in connection with the strongest of traditional views. Just because a scholar or a group of scholars challenges a traditional view, this doesn't mean they've overturned it. So one of the things that I want to do is to say, wait a minute, scholars might question a traditional view, but unless they've really overturned it, they can't claim to have offered something stronger in its place, unless they really have offered something stronger in its place. So one of the things that I call that is just second criticality. You have second naivete, where a person's traditional ideas challenged by criticism, coming to a second naivete where they look at things with a new appreciation of innocence. Well, that's all fine and good, and Paul Ricoeur described that as kind of a transition people come to as they mature in their understandings of things. But second naivete is not the end. What do you do with the fact that different scholars disagree with each other? Different critical paradigms don't always agree with each other. Well, I think you have to be critical about criticism also, as well as tradition. So one of the approaches that this introduction takes unabashedly is to say, well, let's criticize criticism as well as tradition, hoping that the strongest platforms within biblical scholarship, but also traditional understandings, will have an audience for contemporary readers. So in that sense, when it comes to authorship, when it comes to composition, I'm happy to take into consideration the views of scholars, but just because it's a scholar's view, it doesn't mean that it's right. It has to be tested. And so I go with evidence, I go with what's most compelling, and sometimes a traditional view is also compelling, even though it may have been argued a long time ago. A third approach that this introduction takes is that it offers some paradigms that I've been working with myself. There are 4 independent essays. I'll call them excurses, which develop particular theories that seem compelling to me. Two of the excurses are pretty standard. You look at the Christological hymns of the New Testament, you look at the philosophic and religious background of Paul. Well, those are essays that pretty much any other biblical scholar could have written in quite the same way. But the first 2 excurses offer new theories which I think are worth engaging. The first one has to do with the composition of the Gospel of John. I see the Gospel of John as written alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I see it as to some degree a complement to Mark. If John is familiar with Mark, maybe John is different on purpose. So I call this a Bi-Optic hypothesis. John and Mark offer 2 different perspectives on the ministry of Jesus with intentionality, and whereas Matthew and Luke built upon Mark, I think the Gospel of John builds around Mark. And so it's not just a synoptic hypothesis that you'll find in every other New Testament introduction, but you'll find also a Bi-Optic hypothesis, including the Gospel of John alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and other traditions as well, that are worth considering for understanding all 4 Gospels together, not just the first 3 against the Gospel of John. The second excursus, therefore, looks at John's contribution to the quest for the historical Jesus. The first 3 quests for Jesus have left John out programmatically. Now, you can understand that scholars are trying to be safe and conservative in not making statements that are beyond what the evidence suggests. But the fact is that the Gospel of John has historical material in it, as well as being theological. So I think that this may call for a fourth quest for Jesus, one that includes the Gospel of John instead of leaving it out. And in that sense, a part of what I do in this introductory text is just to draw in some of the findings of the John, Jesus, and History project, which I've been a part of for the last 15 years, but also putting forward some of my own views as to how the Jesus of history, as well as the Christ of faith, should be envisioned in looking at the Gospel of John. Now, as we begin with biblical text, the first task is exegetical. What does the text say? What did it say back then, and what does it therefore say in later generations? The next task is therefore hermeneutical. What does the text mean? And so, how does it speak to us in our situation? The third task is to ask, how do we apply the text? And therefore, what I've listed in the introductory chapter is several disciplinary approaches to how to think about the meaning of the New Testament. You have to begin with text criticism. What's the earliest text? There are different other types of criticism. You have form analysis. What is literary form of a text? You have relations between the Gospels. So that involves source analysis and also editorial analysis or redaction analysis. That might move us to even thinking about how does a reader understand the material? So what is the reader's response to the content of the New Testament? Well, browse through these different methodological approaches to the New Testament, but most importantly, be open to how God speaks to you. If the New Testament is a collection of inspired writings, at least as the organizers of the canon believed that these writings were inspired in terms of their origin, but also in their reading and in their reception. Well, how does that question continue for today? How does the Spirit who inspired the text also inspire a reading of the text? So read the New Testament thoughtfully, read it prayerfully, see what kinds of new insights come to you as you seek to apply and understand and interpret the content of the New Testament writings in their original context, but also as to how they speak to today's context. Thanks a lot, and I hope you have a really good experience jumping into the New Testament and engaging the first chapter. Thanks again.